Kendall.
Please report. Mr. Smith, Mr. Hammer. At the close of his argument just now, Mr. Hammerand said that everything the defendant did before, during, and after this event shows that he committed first-degree murder. Everything before, during, and after shows that John Green was running away from stress in his life, running away from things he didn't want to have to deal with, things at the end of this that he didn't bring about, that he didn't start. When you look at the evidence in this case, not just what Mr. Hammerand wants it to be, when you look at the actual evidence in this case, everything in there is consistent with what John Green eventually told the police. And I'm not denying he lied to the police. That is wrong. And that was a mistake. But you don't convict him on lying to the police. You convict him on the evidence, if there is any. And I'm going to go through that with you, and I'm going to show you that everything that we have that we know about is consistent with what he told you, both in the interview and when he was on the stand. I guess where I'd like to start with that, the most obvious, is that when John was on the stand here, he told you that he had paid Mark $150 for rent, paid him a couple times some cash. Let's look at what the evidence is that would support that. You heard from Dan Coster. You heard from him that Mark was very frugal, that Mark was on the cheap side of things. Do you think that Mark would be the kind of person who's going to allow someone to live in his house rent-free? You know, just even a friend. Hey, come in, the electricity bill is going to go up, the heating bill may go up, that's okay. Is that consistent with the evidence that you heard? Let's look at some documentary evidence. You remember Steve Spots? He was the banker. Mark had a bank account. And we entered into evidence, Defendant's Exhibit B. It's about a year's worth of Mark's records. Okay? I didn't talk about it when I entered it in with Mr. Spots, but I want you to take a look at this, because here's what you're going to see. Throughout all of these, essentially the prior year leading up to this event, you're going to see lots of those point-of-sale transactions. Okay? Remember, I asked Mr. Spots what a point-of-sale transaction is. That's where they use their card at a place like a Walmart or a Hy-Vee to purchase something. And it will show up on this statement as a point-of-sale transaction. When you get to April of 2009, the last point-of-sale transaction, I asked Mr. Spots, he said it was April 14th of 2009. Everything after that is his unemployment checks coming in, he gets his last Cytel check, he pays his bills, those 2 checks each month that Mr. Hammerand entered. There's no point-of-sale transactions. The rest of the month of April, all of the month of May, the first few days of June, no point-of-sale transactions. Well, you can use your common sense. Why is that? It's because he's got cash that John Green gave him. So that's just one example of why I want you to look at the evidence in this case and not just the emotional side of things. It's really easy to say, you know what, John, you lied to the cops. That's it. I don't need to know anymore. But let's look at the evidence of what happened and see if it fits what actually did happen here when he told the police what he told you. Okay? Remember an opening statement. I told you that these guys are friends for nearly 30 years. Okay? They have a good relationship. Pretty much as good as anyone Mark Coster had. I mean, from what we've heard in the evidence, he had 2 friends essentially. John Green and Tom Fulke. Otherwise, he was essentially alone. He had no one that he was close with. Sandra Kenville, the neighbor, he had an okay relationship with her, it sounded like. I wouldn't necessarily call that a friendship. Maybe you would, that's fine. that's your decision to make. But, you know, the evidence, there's nothing in the evidence to support that there was any kind of lingering hatred between these two gentlemen, that there was any kind of problem, that there was any kind of long-standing gripe. So when Mr. Hammerhand says everything before, that everything the defendant's actions before, during, and after suggest first-degree murder, where in that before picture does that come in? Where does first-degree murder come in this in the days leading up to this event? And that's, remember when we talked in voir dire about motive, and I'm sure Mr. Hammerhand, he's a talented attorney, he's going to address the lack of motive when he gets up here for his rebuttal close. He didn't do it now, but I'm sure he will. And he'll tell you the state doesn't have to prove motive. And that's right. It's not an element, but it's evidence, certainly. And when you talk about evidence and reasonable doubt can come from evidence or the failure or lack of evidence. Okay? If there's no evidence on a point, then the burden of proof isn't met. So what we've got here is a situation where John Green is stressed out. He comes up from his home to Iowa to be with his friend. They've been friends for a long time, and unbeknownst to him, his friend has been diagnosed with a serious mental illness. Now, you heard he always knew that there was something not quite right with Mark, but he didn't know the extent of it. You know, I spent a great deal of time talking about Exhibit C and when the information in this report was disclosed, and you're going to get a copy. You'll get this actual exhibit back with you, and I would like you each to read that. It's not important what I say about it. What's important is what's in here. And you have to judge what's in here with the evidence that you've heard. That's something the police didn't do, and I'll talk about that later. But when John Green comes up here, he knows his friend isn't quite right in the head. He's always been like that. As long as he can remember, up here he's been a little bit different. But this unprovoked attack that he launched on John Green is explainable by Mark's mental health history. Okay? You may recall in opening I talked about the fact that he had assaulted a 7-year-old boy in Arkansas. Okay? That's in this report. And I want you to read that. It talks about the chief complaint and the reasons for admission. It says, patient states that he was slapping a 7-year-old boy in his yard. And what you'll see in this report is that he had a neighbor kid that was harassing him, and he assaulted the kid. He slapped him across the face and was not remorseful for it. It needed to be done. This was him saving the boy. You know, he was a hero figure for doing this in his mind. It was a delusion in his mind that somehow this was a justified act to slap this 7-year-old boy to keep him from harassing Mr. Coster. And that's what led to this referral. And what comes of this, what you'll see, is that Mark Coster had chronic schizophrenia of the paranoid type, and Dr. Konar explained to you some of the symptoms that are associated with that. And he also talked about how that disease plays out, that there are ups and downs. And that's also one of the things that you're going to see in here. I didn't have him explain every term. Some of these are hopefully you'll be able to make sense of these. They're not exactly medical terms. But it talks about it being acute with exacerbation. Okay, exacerbation just means that at some points it's going to get worse. Sometimes it's better, sometimes it's worse. That's exactly what Dr. Konar told you. And that makes sense. You know, it makes sense that somebody with any disease, they're going to have their good times and they're going to have their bad times. Well, folks, let's take a look at what the evidence is. Okay, what is the irrefutable evidence in this case? That at the time John Green got up here to see his friend, unbeknownst to him, Mark was in a bad place mentally, a really bad place. Okay? He had stopped taking care of his activities of daily living, his ADLs. And when you look in here, when he had this bad incident in Arkansas, it's a similar situation. He's not taking care of his ADLs. Okay? He's cut off all ties with his family members. And John told you some of the reasons that Mark would state to him why that happened. Okay, he explains in the video a couple times that, you know, that he's had it out with his dad. There was some, he uses the word shit. There was some shit with his dad that had happened. Well, what had happened, he told you, and I'll get to, you know, Mr. Hammerhand's going to make a big deal about, you know, well, he didn't say it then. You know, let's be reasonable here, folks, okay, as far as these minor inconsistencies between what he's saying here today and what he said in here. Okay, I'll take a break from this and let me pick your brain on that for a little bit. Let's think about this. They caught up with Mark, with John in Orange Park, Florida. Okay, and I asked him, you know, is Orange Park, Florida home to you? Do you have any connection to Orange Park? No. He was on a trip. He'd been seeing one of his sons. Was on a trip to see another one of his sons. Okay. So I understand. I'm not trying to criticize law enforcement. I understand that sometimes with law enforcement, you need to catch people off guard. But this wasn't really just catching them off guard. Okay. I mean, it was a little bit more than that, because you saw in the interview when he asked them, "How did y'all find me here?" He wasn't asking them, "How did you come to locate me?" He was saying, "I'm in Orange Park, Florida. I'm just driving through. How is it that you're able to track me down? You know, to this specific location. Why are you here?" The police interpret that as a sinister statement, and I'm sure Mr. Hammerhand did too. You know, because my dad, he was a carpenter in the Air Force, and eventually got on the railroad. He had a saying to a hammer, everything looks like a nail. You know, everything is going to be sinister. And that was the police officer's response, if you recall. It wasn't, oh, well, we could track your phone. You know, he goes into this big spiel about DNA and all of these things. That's how we came to you. And John says, that wasn't what I was asking. I just meant Orange Park. How did you find me here? So you've got to take these inconsistencies with a little bit of a grain of salt. Nobody's going to remember everything the first time you're asked about it. He spent 4 years trying to forget this, and they're expecting you that in an hour he's going to have perfect recall and perfect judgment as to what to say and when. And folks, people aren't perfect, okay? You cannot expect perfection. And I'm going to get to that later as well. That's in one of the jury instructions on justification and self-defense. It talks, getting back to this, it talks in here about the delusions that Mark was having and the problems that he was having with his dad, with his family in general. John told you he had delusions about what his dad had done to him as a kid. That was what prompted his severance of communication with his family. His dad had somehow subjected him to ringworms and benefited from it monetarily and was keeping the money from Mark. When you look at this report and think back to what Dr. Konar said, and you look at the autopsy report, what did Dr. Konar tell you about risk of violence? Who's going to be at a greater risk for violence for someone with schizophrenia? Untreated, in other words, they're unmedicated, and prior history of violence. There was a third, which was substance abuse and alcohol, which we don't have any information on. On those two things, though, Mark is positive for those two factors. He was not medicated, and why do we know that? Again, the evidence. What's the evidence in the case? The autopsy report, when Dr. Thompson testified to it, he was not taking any medications. Antipsychotic medications will show up in your liver when they did the autopsy. The only thing that showed up was caffeine and 2 components of nicotine. The nicotine and then I think he called it cotidine, which was a breakdown of the nicotine. The report, when you look at that, you're going to see the correlation between what was happening in the only documented time of another episode of Mark's schizophrenia. He never, there's no evidence he ever went to any other doctor after that. That's the only documentation. But we do know what happened in this case and the events surrounding it. We know that he was eating poorly. The ironic thing here is that having John there probably benefited him in that regard, having that regular schedule. But what else do we know? You know, in listening to John about what happened, he was very rigid in his routines. He wanted John to go to bed at the same time as him. He would complain about how the meals were cooked. Is that another delusion that maybe John's trying to harm him? Could that be possibly what the breaking point was? You know, when Dr. Konar testified and talked about, I forget the exact term they used, but they essentially with the schizophrenic, when someone with schizophrenia, they're going to compartmentalize people into 2 categories. They're either a good person or a bad person, and there isn't really any room in between, either one or the other. And sometimes people can flip. And I think the words he used is 1 minute they're an angel, and the next minute they're the devil. Okay? That, when you take that information and you compare it to the facts in this case, it absolutely explains what happened here. Now, they don't want you to believe that. They want you to say, well, you know what? This is some completely made-up story. That it's just not true. But look at the evidence. Look at the things that you can't argue with. And it's there. When I started out talking, I told you that the biggest thing that it seemed to me that Mr. Hammerman talked about, and then the thing that they want to, in my mind, focus on the most is the fact that he lied to the police. Let's think about the perfect trap that they set for John Green on this. Unless you have absolute perfect judgment that, as Mr. Hammerman said, that when the police knock on your door and you open it, they say, hey, we're officers from Iowa, you immediately get out and say, you know what? It was self-defense. And apparently you have to be really emotional about it too, or it's not true. It was self-defense. I thought he was going to kill me. Unless you do that, apparently, it's not good enough. If you deny it initially, then everything is a lie. When the police officers talk about these themes, what do they talk about? Accident, mistake, and he attacked you. Okay, those 3 things. Think about the elements that they have to prove for first-degree murder. What are they? Most of them, the 4 and 5 of them, are states of mind. You know, that you do something deliberately, with premeditation, with willfulness, with specific intent. What wipes all of those out? An accident or a mistake. What's the other thing that could potentially defend a murder case? Well, self-defense could, so let's throw in justification. Now, because he wasn't perfect, he didn't come right out and say, you know, this is what happened. Now, anything he says is ruined. Okay? What a perfect trap. If John would have said, you know, hey, if this was an accident, and John said, hey, you know what, this was an accident. And here's why. Mr. Hammerhand's up there saying, you know what, it's the theme. The theme is what did it. He's lying. You've got to understand that, and that ties into John's behavior when he leaves. The police don't always make things better. Some people know that. Some people feel that way. And can you expect perfection from John when this happens? You know, that's really what they're asking is, you know, anytime somebody attacks you, you have to have the perfect judgment to say, you know what I'm going to do is I'm going to call the police and tell them about this because they're going to believe everything I say and everything will be okay And we know that's not always the case. You know, we know that's not the way reality works. And so is it unreasonable to think that he might have some fear or some apprehension? And then you throw in on top of it that he's here, he's stressed out, he's here hiding out from his family. You know, that's not necessarily a great thing, but it's the truth. There was nothing that controverted it. If there was evidence that he wasn't here just getting away from life, taking a break, stressed out, where was it? So that's absolutely true. So when he gets confronted with this situation, let's think about it. His friend of 30 years, who, while different, hasn't been violent in the past, but is suddenly attacking him. He has no reason why, and can't explain this. In his mind, why is this happening? And how does he respond to that? You've got two reactions they talk about in psychology and sociology. He did both of them. Fight or flight. First it was the fight, okay, and that was absolutely justified. And then it was the flight. And what was the flight? Mr. Hammerhand wants you to believe he is running away from a first-degree murder. That he says, I have committed murder, I must hide. Or is this a situation where he says, I can't deal with this? I mean, what was the first thing that he said to the police when they said, what were you thinking when Mark attacked you? What was the first thing he said? I don't want to be here. I mean, that sums it all up, folks. That sums up the fact that he fears for his life. That sums up the fact that he has no other place to be, that he has no alternative course of action. That sums it up, everything right there. I don't want to be here. That's about the most dramatic response you could give, really, if you think about it. Because we felt that way before. You know, that desire when something bad is happening to you, when somebody's doing something bad to you, I don't want to be here anymore. And can we say that it is absolutely unconscionable, that we cannot understand at all, that he would say to himself, you know what, I'm going to just put him in the basement, and I'm going to get the heck out of here. Okay? And can he explain why? Not really. I mean, he knows in his mind what has happened. You know, what has happened to him, he understands. He can't explain why it happened to him. Can he be expected to explain why he's doing this? And they want you to believe that it's like boom, boom, boom. You know, this does take like 2 days for him to process all this and to decide what to do. You know, when after he puts him in the basement, he said that was before dawn. The stores don't open up till 8 or 9 o'clock, so they want you to think that all of this stuff is premeditation. Okay, they want you to think, well, this is all signs of premeditation. It happens after the fact. Okay, if this was so well thought out, so well planned, is that really what's going to happen in this case? That you're going to put the man in his own house in the basement? Mr. Hammerhand's going to say, well, he boxed him in, and he put this water heater on him, and that's true. But think about if this is pre-planned and that this is something that has been well thought out, and that he's going to have thought about before. That's his choice. That's his decision. Right? He's dealing with an unexpected event. And I know Mr. Hammerhand's going to say, well, it's not pre-planned, it's premeditation. Premeditation can take place like that. You know? And I think he can snap his fingers. But let's be honest here, folks. Can you expect someone to premeditate and to deliberate? Okay, when you got the instruction on what deliberately means, okay, that means to deliberate, to think about, to ponder. If you've been attacked and the fight is ongoing, you're asking him to take that break and have the ability to say, you know what, okay, here's this, and weigh this, and weigh that. It's unrealistic. It's not how life works. It's not how the human mind works. Okay? And that goes from malice aforethought Again, look at the elements of that offense. It's a forethought. And look at what the lack of motive here. You know, if there was malice aforethought, if there was some reason that he had to hate his friend or to do this to his friend, wouldn't we have seen, wouldn't it be out there, honestly? The fact that it's not there shows that this happened suddenly, unexpected. Several times in this case, you've heard the prosecution try to sort of amp up the evidence or latch onto an idea that the facts just don't support. And I know that in closing statement and opening statement, it's not evidence, and we're free to say what we want. And I believe that we all do the best we can at that. But I recall from Mr. Smith's opening statement, he said that John Reed hit him in the back of the head. What a dastardly act that was. And how, of course, that would knock someone to the ground and give you the opportunity to jump on top of them and choke them out in a premeditated, deliberate fashion. But that's not what the evidence was. And it came up with Officer Jansma. You know, Mr. Hanrahan asked him a question, and he started it out with, did he say he hit him in the back of the head with, let me back up. You know why he had to back up? Because it's not even, it didn't happen that way. They talked with Dr. Thompson about the scalp being damaged at the back of the head. Why would they even talk about that? If it wasn't to try to tie it into this idea that is complete fiction, that John Reed whacked him in the back of the head with a bat. You know, look at the medical evidence on that. What did Dr. Thompson say the medical evidence was on that? Decomposition, totally normal. The fact that they had to pry him up off the ground could have happened then. Could have happened in a number of ways. Could have happened post-mortem. Absolutely no way to tell. Let's talk about 2 minutes. They've been saying 2 minutes, 2 minutes, 2 minutes. And when Mr. Hanrahan got up here for the first part of his closing argument, he said it was seemed like an eternity. But then, you know, old habits die hard, and by the end of it, he was back to 2 minutes. That is a complete crock. There is no way to say that they struggled for 2 minutes. And you look at that interview. I would like you to look at that interview again and listen to how that question came up. You heard it again here. What would you say? Was it 30 seconds? A minute? Probably. Probably. His response was probably. Well, come on, give us a time. It doesn't happen like that with a bat. It doesn't happen like that. These are the cops telling him, hey man, what you're saying, if it's 30 seconds, it doesn't happen like that with a bat. You better tell us, you know, up the number, buddy. Get it higher. Get it higher. Why are they trying to get that number higher? Because the prosecutor's going to come in later and argue that it was premeditation and that there was enough time to premeditate and deliberate. I hope that you see that in the evidence. It is there. You have to open your eyes. You know, what we talked about with Richard Crivello, he was the gentleman that did a lot of different tests in this. I think one of the things he did was the handwriting. I think he did the fingerprints as well. This idea of confirmation bias. And what I said earlier, to a hammer, everything looks like a nail. As a scientist, he said they have to try to avoid that. They actively have to try to avoid confirmation bias. And he says, you know, for the most part, he believes that their officers and scientists do in that division, they're criminals. And I believe they do. One of the things he talked about was when they're comparing fingerprints, they don't put a name on them. They'll put a number on them so that they don't accidentally have some information that they're going to transpose and be more likely to say, oh, that's the one. You know, that idea of confirmation bias is that if you're looking for something to be X, then that's what you're going to look for all the evidence that supports X. And what do you think the cops were looking for when they found Mark's body? I mean, it is kind of like a crime show. Okay, well, there's a body buried in the basement. Well, that's got to be murder. There absolutely can't be any other reasonable explanation other than murder. So that's what we're investigating. And you look at that interview and you tell me I'm wrong. That they aren't asking those questions, trying to get a murder conviction. And you know what? Actions do speak louder than words. John Thompson said that they went down there for an informational meeting. Hey, this was informational. We weren't down there for anything other than information. That's why the prosecutor flew down to this. You know, that's why he was arrested an hour after this. Before they had this. Before they knew the true details and depths of Mark's schizophrenia. Before they knew the evidence, the whole picture, they arrested him for murder. Folks, in voir dire, we heard one of the prospective jurors, I don't think it's any of you, talk about the time when he was a kid, he got punished for something he didn't do. And I recall that. That happened to me once. My dad worked for the railroad for 42 years. The Burlington Northern Railroad. He was gone a lot of the time. There was a time with the Burlington Northern where they would lease their employees out to Amtrak. And so he was riding passenger trains throughout the part of he had a short trip and a long trip. On the short trip, he'd go down to the Twin Cities and back, and he'd be gone a couple days. On the long trip, he'd be gone out to Havre, Montana.
To where?
Havre, Montana. Yeah, Havre. He was a baggage man, so he'd sit in the car right next to the baggage car and deal with the bags as they came on and off the train. And, you know, my mom did a lot of things, but she was not, she was not the disciplinarian. That was my dad. So one day my brother and I were out, we wanted to play some basketball. And we had two cars. My dad drove one to the train station in Dilworth, Minnesota, and down to Fargo, depending on if he was working freight or Amtrak. And the one car would be left behind for my mom. Well, the car that we took that particular trip was the one that was closest to the door. And the car that was furthest away blocked the basketball. And my brother and I wanted to play basketball. So, and I'm sorry for this. The reason I'm emotional is, as I said, my mom passed away. And I haven't really talked about this other, so this is the first time I've talked about this particular incident in this type of situation. I apologize. Please don't hold my emotions against my client. So we needed to move the car in order to play basketball. And my brother did it. He went out and got it, put the keys in, moved it, we shot some moves. He went over to a friend's house. My mom came out, realized the car had been moved. I'm the only one there. And so I took, she wait till your dad gets home. And my dad, he didn't see any of this. I mean, he had to do the best he could. I'm the one that got spanked. That was an injustice, okay? My brother, no punishment whatsoever. That's an injustice. And this is sort of similar, okay? It's sort of similar because we don't hold people responsible for the things that they're not responsible for. Okay? It is wrong to punish someone for a murder when a murder didn't happen. He killed Jim. He killed Mark Oscar. Okay, but that doesn't mean that it's murder. You have to look at those crimes, all of them. Murder first degree, murder second degree, voluntary manslaughter. And you have to go element by element to see if the state has proven those. And of all of those, maybe voluntary manslaughter fits this. Maybe. And that's because, there's no malice with voluntary manslaughter. It's, they call it heat of passion. The officer mentioned that in the interview. Essentially, it's being provoked into killing someone. There's an action done to you, a serious provocation, and you respond with death. And the person dies. That's voluntary manslaughter. So if you were to say, you know what, I don't believe the justification in this, I don't believe he was justified, I believe Mr. Hammerhand with his theory of how this happened, even though, listen to that interview again. Please listen to that again. They want to pick out little bits of what John said. He said the same topic several different times, and they're picking out one that's sandwiched in there. But, You know, that voluntary manslaughter, that is certainly a possibility in this case, if you did not believe that this was in self-defense. That Mark's attack of John Green, while his response may not have been completely justified, it is not murder. There's no malice. You know, you do not need malice for voluntary manslaughter. There's no premeditation, there's no malice, there's no deliberate action. But I think if you look at the evidence in this case, the evidence is clear. Compare what you've heard to the actual evidence. The evidence in this case compels you to find John Green not guilty. The law in this case requires you to find him not guilty. Justice in this case demands a verdict of not guilty. Thank you for your time.
You need any time?
Just a couple minutes, Your Honor. We can stretch break, or if the court wants to take a short break.
If you want to just stand and stretch while we do that.